In my very first video on this channel, I briefly mentioned the first effort to start a drivers' union by Curtis Turner, and how that effort got him banned from NASCAR for life by President and CEO of NASCAR at that time, Big Bill France Sr. But not mentioned in that video was the long, tumultuous story of Curtis Turner's career and his eventual return to NASCAR racing, where he gave the France family the biggest middle finger they've ever gotten. Well, at least until the New York State Highway Patrol got involved, that is. Curtis Turner's story begins in Floyd, Virginia. Born in 1924, he was too young to get into the vast rum-running black market back in the roaring 20s. But even after the repeal of Prohibition, many counties in the southern U.S. still outlawed the sale of liquor. And although he denied taking any part in the illicit trade, he certainly did like to spend an awful lot of time with known bootleggers and shine hustlers. He was never caught trying to make a moonshine run, and for an understandable reason too. Unlike most other early NASCAR stars, Turner did not come from poverty or a working-class background. Instead, he took on an executive role at his family's timber business and made some serious cheddar. And I'm not talking about 5 or 6 figure sums. Oh no. He reportedly made millions, and that's before adjusting it for inflation. Timber was apparently big business in Virginia. Unfortunately for him, but rather fortunate for us, he blew all of that money partying. With seemingly no regard for his future, Turner spent as much money as he made, and one of his favorite money pits was auto racing. He entered his first race in 1946 at the age of 22 in Mount Airy, North Carolina. And by 1948, he had made a big enough name for himself in the stock car racing scene of the South that he was ready with all of the necessary funds and equipment to run the first season of officially sanctioned NASCAR competition. The 1948 modified season was a grueling 52-race schedule, held across dozens of tracks over the course of 10 months. But Curtis got his first win at North Wilkesboro in July. He won 7 times in total that season, and when the Strictly Stock Series began in 1949, he jumped on that too, winning at the treacherous Langhorne circuit. The Strictly Stock division would go on to become the Cup Series today, the highest level of NASCAR competition. And although Curtis Turner loved the big stage and the big paychecks of the top series, he found a nice home for himself in the Convertible Series, in which he won 22 of 47 races in 1956, but finished second in the standings to Bob Wellborn, who had a paltry 3 wins, but had been way more consistent. But the championship didn't seem to matter much to Turner. He was just blowing his fortune, winning it all back, and having a good old time. And even on the track, he raced like a man who had nothing to lose, as though he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that some guys were out here competing for year-end championships. The concept of having long-term goals like that just seemed foreign to him. If Curtis wasn't winning, then he was usually breaking equipment or getting into a wreck, usually on purpose too. His driving style gave him the nickname Pops, not because of any fatherly affectations he garnered, but because he was known to just come up and pop you in the rear bumper for no reason other than the fact that he was just bored at that particular moment. In one instance at Bowman Gray Stadium, Curtis drove a young Bobby Allison clear out of the groove going into the first turn of the first lap. Later, when Curtis tried to do the same thing to Bobby again, Bobby dumped Curtis, and the two swerved into the infield and began having a 1-versus-1 demolition derby as they started ramming into each other, and the race had to be put on hold until one of them just gave up. Bobby Allison was dumbfounded as to why anyone would race like that. But to all the veterans in the field, it was just par for the course whenever Curtis was around. Turner would even beat and bang with his teammate Joe Weatherly, not because he didn't like him, but just because they thought it was tons of fun. The two were great friends, and every year before the Daytona Beach race, they'd rent out a house on the beach somewhere and would party for days leading up to the race. When the big day finally arrived, they would show up, hungover, dehydrated, and sleep deprived, and they would usually end up winning or finishing in the top 5. They honestly enjoyed putting on a show for the fans, even if their car owner Ralph Moody had to pick up the tab for it at the end of the day. One time at Darlington, one of the highest paying tracks on the circuit, Curtis was specifically instructed to not touch Joe Weatherly's car, or else the team wouldn't pit him. Well, old Curtis went out there and started slamming into everyone anyway, including Weatherly. And when it came time to pit, Curtis pulled into his stall and the team just looked at him and waved him off. Legend has it he had to change his own tires and fill his own car with gas himself. And as you might have guessed, there were even some drivers who were tired of Turner's shenanigans. After he won a race in Virginia by spinning out Lee Petty, the patriarch of the soon-to-be racing dynasty went up to Curtis after the race. Now, Lee's income came solely from racing. He didn't have a lumber business to fall back on. He needed to win or at least not bang up his car in order to put food on the table for his family. So when he got only a few bucks at the end of the day in a torn-up race car, he was livid. He calmly walked up to Curtis after the race and tapped him with a rolled-up newspaper and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you." Curtis put down his adult beverage and decided he would oblige the career racer with a conversation. As soon as he turned to face Petty, Lee started wailing on him with a rolled-up newspaper, which had a torque wrench inside of it. Needless to say, Lee Petty was on Curtis Turner's hit list from that day forward. Big Bill France absolutely loved Curtis and his antics. He said of him, "He was the greatest race car driver I ever saw," which might have been a bit of puffery, but he knew that Curtis was a massive draw. Anytime he could put the Virginian's name on the program, he was going to have a sellout crowd. After all, he was the first multi-time winner of NASCAR's Most Popular Driver Award. The 40s and 50s are filled with unbelievable tales of Turner and his antics. He was a total freak show and everyone loved it. Well, everyone who didn't have to share a racetrack with him, that is. But by the turn of the decade, Curtis had his sights set on something big. Something that would revolutionize the sport. It was rare for a man who seemed to have no worry about tomorrow, finally having an epiphany out of nowhere like this. But in the late 50s, he wants to build a racetrack. And not just any track. A track bigger and better than Darlington. One with 24 degrees of banking that was 1.5 miles long. And he was going to call it the Charlotte Motor Speedway. Nowadays, Bruton Smith likes to take credit for the track that we know today, but in reality it was Curtis who planned it all out, designed it, and even put up the early money to get the project off the ground. Smith didn't come into the picture until later, but was extremely helpful in getting the final pieces in place. By May of 1960 it was done, and the first World 600 was held. Curtis Turner took on a lot of debt with the project, and the winner's purse was paid out of his own pockets. Joe Lee Johnson won the race and was awarded a staggering cash prize of $27,000. Curtis finished 39th in that race with a blown head gasket, but immediately after the race he set out to solve all of his debt problems. He hired an accounting firm to get everything in order, and by 1961 pretty much everything was either paid off or well on its way to being in the black. But the board of directors didn't see it that way and ousted him as the president of the track. Bruton Smith, to his credit, who was the vice president at that time, resigned in protest. Curtis did still have a position at the track, and even though he wasn't in charge anymore, he still worked to keep the track afloat. One idea that had been floated out there was unionizing the drivers. The Teamsters were very interested in the idea, and once the ball got rolling in 1961, they offered up an $800,000 loan to the Speedway. They worked with Turner to create the Federation of Professional Athletes, a precursor to the Players Association today. For just $10 a month, a driver could have collective bargaining power against NASCAR, with the full backing of the Teamsters. The FPA vows to fight for a pension program, better payouts for races, and a cut of TV broadcasting rights revenue. A budding but promising market in the early 60s. By August of that year, Curtis had a majority of drivers paying dues, and the Charlotte Motor Speedway backing him, who were very interested in the idea of broadcasting rights. Other tracks not owned by NASCAR are also waiting to see what will happen. Some of the biggest stars in the sport are fully behind Turner on this, and they aren't just paying dues but actively encouraging others to join them. Fireball Roberts and champion Tim Flock are Turner's most ardent supporters. Big Bill France, once Curtis Turner's biggest fan, turns on him. He says of the whole situation, "No known Teamster can compete at a NASCAR race. I'll use a pistol to enforce it." The threat doesn't seem to work as Turner and the others are holding their ground, and the fans are split on it as the weeks drag on. Before a race at Bowman Gray Stadium, Big Bill has had enough and decrees, "Gentlemen, before I have this union stuffed down my throat, I will plow up my 2.5-mile track at Daytona Beach and plant corn in the infield. We'll fight this union to the hilt." He then immediately bans Curtis Turner, Fireball Roberts, and Tim Flock on the spot for life. France cites a seldom used clause in the NASCAR rules, saying that the trio are guilty of, quote, actions detrimental to stock car racing, which is pretty much a catch-all bit of legalese that is still used to this very day against drivers who step out of line and do anything the sanctioning body doesn't like. Within 2 days, Fireball Roberts, a career racer, reluctantly resigns from the union and returns to NASCAR racing. Many others follow suit, not wanting to bite the hand that feeds, and before long the union is dissolved. Even after its disintegration, France still upholds the lifetime bans of Turner and Flock. Charlotte Motor Speedway, now with no financial backing from the Teamsters, goes bankrupt, and was only saved at the 11th hour by its board of directors, now headed by Bruton Smith. Turner returns to Virginia and goes back to the only 2 things he knows, racing and the timber business. He enters unsanctioned races all over the country, just trying to win back some of his lost glory. He's still hailed as a hero by racing fans all over the South. Even if they didn't care for some Yankee union coming into their sport, they could still appreciate a man with an outlaw's reputation. Turner even attempted a couple of races in IndyCar in the early 60s with little success. He attempted to qualify for the Indy 500 but never made the cutoff. As the years went on, it seemed like it would just become another footnote in NASCAR history. A blip on the radar. A man who tried to fight the law and the law would end up winning against. Just another victim in a never-ending fight for workers' rights and better treatment. This was supposed to be his grave. But thanks to Big Bill's hubris, Curtis Turner would get a second chance. In 1964, Chrysler Corp dominated with their Hemi engine. They wiped the floor with the competition. And going into 1965, NASCAR banned the Hemi engine and Chrysler Corp boycotted NASCAR in protest. Since they had Richard Petty on contract, they sent him to go drag racing for the year. That way he could still represent the make in some level of racing. Ford also had a dispute with NASCAR in 1965 over engines and threatened to pull out entirely, taking all of their drivers off the track as well. With two of the big three leaving the sport, as well as Fireball Roberts and Joe Weatherly passing away in racing incidents the year prior, NASCAR had no stars left to put out there. Races were just a hodgepodge of whoever could be thrown out there on a given race day, and attendance was dwindling. France contacted Turner and Flock and told them the ban was lifted. Perhaps out of principle, Tim Flock declined the offer and never raced in NASCAR again. He was a champion and had nothing left to prove. But Turner, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to give France a big fat "I told you so." He makes a few starts to begin his 1965 campaign, but at the first race ever held at Rockingham Speedway, he seizes an opportunity of a lifetime. On Halloween Day 1965, Curtis Turner led 239 of 500 laps at the high-banked 1-mile oval and held off a hard-charging Jim Paschal and a young Cale Yarborough to win his first race in 6 years. He crossed the line to thunderous cheers and put a cap on a remarkable career. It would end up being his final win, and much like his colleague Tim Flock, he had accomplished all he'd set out to do. He competed part-time from then until 1968, just racing whenever it struck his fancy and the money was right. He was set to make just one start in 1970 for a publicity stunt, but in October of that year he was chauffeuring professional golfer Clarence King in his personal airplane and crashed into the hills of Pennsylvania not long after takeoff. The NASCAR world was stunned. Curtis was only in his mid-40s and likely had a few more starts left in him, but now we'd all just have to speculate as to what he still had in mind. He's remembered fondly as a man who took no prisoners, whether it be on the racetrack or in the boardroom. Curtis Turner lived a life that the rest of us could only dream of. He did what he wanted to do. The money and the bosses be damned. He built one of the best tracks on the circuit that still exists today. He lived every day like it was his last day on Earth. And when he passed away in 1970, it's pretty safe to say that he had no regrets about the life he had lived. At the end of the day, when you take a look at his career, what more could you possibly want out of a racer? Anyway, I'm Slapshoes. Thanks for watching, and until next time, y'all take it easy.